So, talking about a revolution is a collection of essays that I published this year, and I've described it as a coda to my 20s. So it encapsulates my growth over a really tumultuous decade.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. Assalamu alaikum. I ask Allah to forgive me for the frailty of being human and any errors that I may make. Well, this is just such an amazing opportunity for me because, I know all kinds of cool people, but this amazing person here is someone that it's my first time to have a one-on-one chat with Yassmin Abdel-Magied, who is a Sudanese Australian writer, broadcaster, and award-winning social advocate. A former mechanical engineer, Yassmin is committed to social justice, challenging established narratives and making complex ideas accessible to all. Yassmin has published 4 books with Penguin Random House, including essay collection Talking About a Revolution, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. Yay. And 2 novels for younger readers, You Must Be Layla and the award-winning Listen, Layla. She writes regularly for the New Era of The Guardian and her own Substack Diasporan Diaries, an award-winning speaker and globally sought-after advisor on issues at the intersections of race, gender, and faith. Yassmin has delivered keynotes and workshops in 25 countries. Youth Beyond Borders at the age of 16. She founded her first organization, Youth Without Borders, at the age of 16, leading it for 9 years before co-founding 2 other organizations focused on serving women of color. Her TED Talk, What Does My Headscarf Mean to You, has been viewed over 2.5 million times, and was selected as one of TED's annual top 10 ideas. Wow, so marvelous. Again, it really is a pleasure and an honor to have you. And I just want you to talk a little bit about, pulling together, talking about a revolution, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Woodward. And it is also such a pleasure for me to be in conversation with you as well. I think, as someone who likes to live in the realm of ideas and is constantly, searching for people whose writing and thinking, I'm inspired by and learn from. I mean, your name has always been part of those that I have read and learned a lot from. So it is really, alhamdulillah, such an honor and pleasure to be in conversation with you. So talking about a revolution is a collection of essays that I published this year, and I've described it as a coda to my 20s. So it's sort of about half the book are essays that I've written from the age of about 21, all the way through my 20s. And then about half of them are brand new essays that I wrote when I was 30. So it encapsulates my growth over a really tumultuous decade. But also, I think part of why I wanted to, there were a number of reasons why I wanted to pull it together. One, because I wanted a sort of body of work that spoke to that period, being in my 20s, and also, going from somebody who was a grassroots organizer who really cared about the world and so on, but really had my politics change and develop over time. And I wrote as my politics changed and developed. And you can see that throughout the book, the kinds of ways that I approach things and approach challenges and see the world at the age of 21 is, alhamdulillah, quite different to 30. And I mean, you would hope that by, your perspective on the world changes. And part of why I wanted to do that, part of why I wanted to put it all in one collection was because I wanted to be quite honest about that growth and maybe in some way generous with it, because I think, especially for young people, there's this maybe sometimes idea that we come out of the womb, fully developed, and we come out of the womb with all the right politics and so on. But that was not my experience at all. I inherited politics from my parents. I inherited, understanding the world from my community and my society and the context that I grew up in, which was a socially conservative state in Queensland, Australia. And yes, I had, the sort of anti-imperialist perspective from my father and so on, but he is also a bit of a capitalist and so on. And so there's all these sorts of things that as you go through your 20s and continue, you sort of start to work out and you start to sort of say, well, my experiences are like this. Does it match what my parents have told me, what my community has told me, what my teachers have told me, and how do I make these my own? So, talking about the revolution is also talking about my own personal evolution, right? It's kind of sharing that development and evolution in politics. And the second sort of main desire for me in putting, or objective in putting this collection together, was about trying to get us to pick through these very knotty contemporary kind of cultural conversations that I think, exist in an online discourse and exist in a sort of broad public discourse in very superficial ways. But I was very interested to dig a little bit deeper, to kind of, talk about what abolition means maybe in a day-to-day conversation, or to talk about if we, what does it mean for me to call myself Black, and how to, and it is seen as a very black and white issue, but in different contexts, there are different ways that in different countries, it plays out completely differently. And my relationship with the word has changed over time based on the context and so on. And so I wanted a space, and then obviously speaking about my own personal experiences in the public eye and how that has changed me in my relationship to grief, and my relationship to sort of the public eye, and how that's changed over time. And so I guess, and maybe I might read a little bit, if I may, from the introduction.
Yes, please.
The question I ask is, if we cannot even properly talk about revolution, how are we meant to achieve it? First, we create the world we want with language, and then language builds the world. And I write a little bit in this introduction about why I wanted to pull this book of essays together. And I say, I have wanted to pull together a book of essays the moment I knew such a thing was possible. I find the form compelling, suited to thoughtfully drawing together a diverse array of topics connected by a broad, rich theme. Individually, single essays offer deep dives into or meditations on a particular issue. A collection allows the pieces to be in dialogue with one another, to arrive at a sound greater than its parts. So as the third decade of the 21st century began, while mine was just ending, it seemed the perfect time to reflect on my writing and thinking thus far. Select, revise, and republish some of the work that I'm most proud of from the last 9 years, while also taking the time to craft a number of new pieces, capturing the questions, reflections, and conclusions I've arrived at the end of my tumultuous 20s. Together, the collection strips back the layers of story, myth, and obfuscation obscuring so much contemporary discourse today, revealing the underlying dynamics and asking the questions, what is really going on here? Are we satisfied? Is this the best we can do? And how do we build a better world? I approach these questions with a philosophy deeply influenced by Islamic liberationary theology, Black feminist civil rights activists, and the legacy of anti-imperialism, with critiques of our current neoliberal world order naturally folded into the approach. I offer alternative ways of thinking about the world from the perspective of a diaspora African Muslim woman, deeply committed to the concept of justice for all, regardless of who it means I must stand against. I make space to eulogize and lament for bygone eras, but do not let my nostalgia hold me back from facing forward into our future and marching determinedly into it. So that sets the scene.
Well, thank you so much. I kind of want to share, with you, you're spotlighted at different things in the media and everything. So, I click on things and I read, but, I can't say that I knew you personally in the struggle. I resonated with you. And so the first thing that I did was to order your youth books. You Must Be Layla and Listen Layla. And there we go.
Yeah, I can pull them out. This is Listen Layla. This is the British cover. And here we go.
So Layla. And I as an undergraduate, my first desire was to major in Black children's literature, if you can imagine, in the 70s, before you were born.
Wow.
That did not materialize because there was no consideration of children's literature, and there wasn't yet an established relationship with Black literature. So it just was like before the time. But I only say that to say that it's important to have as young people, it's important to have access to characters who remind you of you. And sometimes, in the city that I lived in, they would have a Black Children's Festival. And, I would just go in and buy several dozen books. It would be like a thing to do, because it's like, you just need to have these titles. You just need to have these faces. You just need to have these stories. So in that way, I think it is something that you manage in all of your work to cover a lot of ground. And it may seem subtle, but I think in some ways it's just a reflection that you sort of, you have a very effervescent personality. And, alhamdulillah, you put that into your interest in social justice. And yet these two, they really tell, a certain story about negotiating in a certain age range, which I think is probably very close to the reality that you experience, as you say, as a diasporic African woman who grew up, in Australia. Kudos for you for that, because they not only remain upbeat, but they're also challenging. The fact that it's, the female character who keeps her grit, and at the same time, does face all certain challenges. It's just a marvelous. So those are marvelous productions. I felt when I was reading them, I think I mentioned this to you, that they were not meant for me. Like maybe my grandchildren,
Yeah.
And so you were, finishing up talking about a revolution at that time, and you generously sent me an electronic copy, so I could read it. So then I said, okay, well, now let me see the grown-up Layla, who is Yassmin, and you didn't lose any of your enthusiasm, alhamdulillah. I'm curious what you think, is the distinction, what would be, at least two things that you think are very different with regard to your 20s and, after your 20s.
It's so interesting, because I think I've become a lot more cynical. So it's, my first book, I wrote it for Yassmin's story, which was a very wholesome memoir. And I think back to that, to writing that, and the person who wrote that. And I just had, I think, this kind of optimism and unshakable faith in everything working out that I don't necessarily think that I have at the moment. I have, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that I'm somebody that has become pessimistic by any means. But I definitely think that the person that I am today, and the way that I kind of approach some of these challenges is with a much more pragmatic and realist eye, which is perhaps even more powerful. I guess I have maybe to sort of dig a little bit deeper. I think that I have transitioned from being somebody who focuses on individual change and individualized change to somebody who's much more interested in the structural and the systemic. And I appreciate that there is a sense of empowerment when we approach things from an individual perspective. Like, I will be able to, and it's that sort of neoliberal mentality of, if I can succeed, then everybody succeeds. I remember saying to people, if I can show people that, Muslims are XYZ, or if I can show people that Africans are XYZ, then that'll make things better for everybody. But that, unfortunately, is not necessarily how things change. Or certainly that's what I now believe. I'm much more interested in, well, rather than the exception, rather than becoming the exception, rather than spending all my time trying to navigate treacherous waters and navigate systems that are not set up for us to succeed at all. You are succeeding despite the system rather than because of it. How do I change the playing field? How do I completely change the frame of reference? That's also partly why I'm so interested in language, because I think the language, the ways in which language is used, sort of, it's like it sets the rules, and it sets the way that we understand things. And I go back and forth on this, because sometimes I'm like, if we focus too much on language and too much on symbol, then we get lost in the aesthetics and we don't focus on material change, right? So how do we, maintain a focus on, or maintain an interest and engagement with language to make sure that, we're not ceding control, but at the same time also make sure that we're not just in the world of symbols, but we're also interested in material reform. And for me, it is not just maybe once upon a time it was just about, who's in the boardrooms and representation politics, but now it's actually like, well, this has to be across class. It has to be kind of it cannot be simply just for, replacing who's in the elite does not necessarily mean life is materially better for everybody. So I think that's where, one of the significant places that my politics has changed since my 20s. I think maybe also, Doctor, I think I'm actually much less interested in being um immediately relevant in the world of media. I think, I was a big believer as a young person of like my face being out there, and if I can just be on the panel, and if I can just be in the room, and if I can and sort of contributing to a conversation in that fast-paced manner. I'm like, actually, is that where the change in the thought is happening? Is that actually helpful? Is that actually useful? I'm not sure. And I'm no longer interested in putting my energy into places where I don't think it serves the thing that I'm trying to do long term. And I'm not actually sure how much putting my face in the front of XYZ is powerful. That is why I'm interested in the slow work of writing a book rather than writing, many essays for online platforms, for example. So that also means that I have said no to many opportunities that I would have said yes to in the past, many opportunities to sort of have a bombastic discussion with somebody on a panel show or whatever, things that did raise my profile in the past, but ultimately I'm not sure if they move the needle in any way. I'm not sure if they were actually contributing to a shift. And so I guess now I have a much more discerning or strategic approach to where I put my energy and put my time. And I have to ask myself consistently, is this something that is serving the thing that I want to do, which is work for justice and try to, make life better for everyone, inshallah? Or is this simply, am I just a pawn in somebody else's game?
Great questions. And trust me, you're going to have to ask them for a long time. There's a word that goes with this transformation. I think they call it maturity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I actually use that for people because I think it's so wholesome to have the enthusiasm of youth, especially because yours already, that focus, the issues that I think, are important as well. So it's nice to have that complete, sort of individualistic, you call it neoliberal optimism, especially because you took that energy and you put it into things, and you put it into, helping to construct things that could, move the larger agenda along. But I would worry if you had maintained it forever and ever, because it would seem like a little bit naive. And so as we live and learn. So, as you lived and learned, I also love that you're willing to experiment with things. I have to ask you about the rig.
Please go ahead.
Because, my eyes were like dropping out of my head. I'm like, wow, what is that? Tell us a little bit about that experience, because that is just phenomenal.
So for those who might not be aware, so I graduated from mechanical engineering, and the first real job that I took was as something called a measurement while drilling specialist on oil and gas rigs. So I went into oil and gas. Actually, and I don't know if I actually included this in the book, part of the reason why I went into oil and gas was because I had gotten accepted into quite an exclusive master's in motorsport because I wanted to work in motorsport, but it was very expensive, and so I needed to save up money. And so, the job that was available was in oil and gas. And honestly, I mean, it's funny, people used to ask me all the time, like, oh my God, weren't you worried? Or like, how did you think about this? And blah, blah, blah. And genuinely, I was just like, this is going to be a fun adventure. Like, this is what happens when you're like 19 and 20, you just like, oh yeah, this will be great. No worries at all. How hard could it possibly be? My father was so displeased with me choosing this. He refused to talk to me for about a year. Like he could not accept that I would go down this path, not only because he was like, you're going to be in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of random men. Like, what are you doing? But also, I ended up working for one of the big oil companies that, was not very good to the continent of Africa, which is most of them. But again, I found a way to rationalize it to myself, which these are decisions that I wouldn't make today, but at the time, I found a way to rationalize it to myself, which, yeah, is a funny kind of it's a funny sort of a thing when everybody around you sort of says, well, this is very normal because this is what we all do. And you're like, well, I guess, yeah, that's fine. That's very, it was a big oil company that had very good training. And I was like, well, let me, I want to learn from that. And so, yeah, I mean, I was the first woman that they hired when I first started, that they hired in the first engineering, like the first woman to go into the field. The only other woman they had in the company or in the department, was the secretary. So they genuinely were like, we have no idea what to do with you. And I was quite young, I was 20, and they like people on a regular basis would sort of be like, what are you doing here? Like, are you lost? Did you just come out of prison? Like they were like, somebody asked me, he was like, where did you go wrong in your life that you ended up And I was like, oh God, like I chose this out of my free will, you know. But there was something, I must say, there was something about the sort of like almost the taboo of it that I really found thrilling. There was something about the subversiveness of being in that world. And also this is like not something that I say very often, but when you are living in it, or when you're in an environment where people have literally no idea how, like, what box to put you in because they've never met anyone like you, there's a little bit of freedom in that because you can do whatever you want because they have no preconception. They literally had no preconception of who I was or what I could do or what people like me were like. So anything that I said and did that's what they must be like, you know? And that in itself was a bizarre kind of power.
Yeah. It sounds fun. Actually,
Yeah.
as I was reading it, I was just, I'm trying to relate. This is my thing. I always get into everything that I read. I'm trying to relate to it. And I just thought, oh my goodness, she went out on a rig and she was like not just a Muslim female, she was the only female. Oh, yes. You're so brave.
Yeah.
It's amazing, and it's fun because it's fun for me, in terms of reading it because you did it, even in your writing, it comes across that you put yourself into it fully. And I understand. I have to tell you, the stuff about the car machine and the engineering stuff, I didn't get because I don't know enough about cars. But I knew you had an aspiration that was beyond that. I just didn't understand what that aspiration was clearly because I don't know anything about engineering. I don't know anything about cars. But that thing, like it really stood out. And that your parents let you do it. I mean, you said your father didn't speak to you for a year. I think I probably would have just flipped. It's like, no way, no how. I'm gonna let my daughter go out there at that age to do that. But again, live and learn. You're probably going to be, my all-time favorite. If you want to find a person who will experiment with something and do it with sincerity and do it with gusto, we're going to get Yassmin because she's on top of it.
That is true. So I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. So kudos to you for, maintaining it and, not having any big fallout, not having any meltdown, which is the way that my kids always come to the end of their tether, is always with some kind of a meltdown. So, good for you on that.
Just have it internally. That's all.
I also like, and I want you to talk to us a little bit more about talking about a revolution as a title. Because as I was reading it, other than the things you said, just now, just reading some of the introduction, I was not always clear about the revolution. And you say a revolution, so I'm not going to make it the revolution because language matters. But how did you come to that as the title of this book? And then what do you see is a revolution?
It's a great question. And I think, so I chose this title partly as an homage and partly as an aspiration, I would say. An homage to Tracy Chapman's song, talking about revolution, which I had grown up with, and have always loved. And I love the album that comes from, which is, I think, a very powerful, emotional album that speaks both to the political, but also to sort of moments of, like personal kind of hinge points or like moments in time where things can go in different ways. And so I think I was drawn to the idea of titling this collection talking about a revolution because I was so drawn to this album, and also because I think I wanted to aspire to thinking about how, you know, if I was somebody who claimed to be interested in revolution and claimed to be interested in change, transformative, substantive change, what would it look like for me to write to that idea? And so for me, the idea of revolution and the idea that I was trying to keep in mind as I was writing these essays was as much about, well, not even really about like maybe necessarily like massive political violent or non-violent change, but also about the word change itself. And it holds in it the concept of evolution. It holds in it like moments of change. Even, for example, one of the essays is titled, you know, To All the Cars I've Loved Before. And it's about my relationship with cars, and also me saying that, well, I think I'm going to be the last generation that has a love affair with a petrol car because the future of the petrol car is no longer. And that in itself is a bit of a revolution. And I wanted to have space to talk about that and to grieve this, you know, we sort of are pushing towards dealing with climate change, and I think we must. And also, I think I would love space to grieve a previous world. You know, I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm so old school. I love gears and petrol and, you know, and all of it. And is there space for me in the new world? I don't know, but I wanted to kind of have space to talk about that. And so I guess for me, the word revolution encapsulates change, it encapsulates transformation, it encapsulates evolution, it encapsulates those sort of the only word that's coming to mind is hinge points, but there's a better word for it. There's sort of those sliding door moments, maybe, or those moments where you kind of have to make a choice. You're presented with choices, and the choice is the status quo, or the choice is to do something different. And sometimes, you know, we don't often know at that moment we're making a decision, the ramifications of what that looks like. But that is ultimately how, you know, grand revolutions begin.
Amazing, amazing. So I understand very clearly about, you know, the diasporic. I'm not diasporic because I'm a hybrid, but I understand that as far as, you know, locating yourself, because you do take us through aspects of, you know, your upbringing and your family ties and your visits to the Sudan and the history, you know, in terms of your family, you know, in the Sudan and being, you know, quite revolutionary, you know, both your parents. But I would like to know, maybe I missed it, but internally in the context of Islam and Muslims, what do you feel is your biggest challenge or the biggest revolution that you would like to see happen? I mean, you know, how does that play out? Because I would imagine, I mean, I have a lot of that, like way more than I ever could have asked for. But I'm just curious, you know, for yourself, you know, how do you situate yourself within the intra-Muslim discourse?
Yeah, it's really interesting, this question. So I would say I grew up in a sort of relatively, like, Sudanese tend to be either like there's a quite strong Sufi element in the Sudanese society, but generally like generally the world that my parents grew up in was socially conservative, but like what we might say is like they like moderate Muslim. And since um well, post 1979, the revolution in Iran, and then post 1989, when Umar al-Bashir, the dictator, came to power, the society sorry, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of context. The society increasingly was influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, and also by, you know, Saudi Wahhabism and so on. And so, like, the Sudan of today and the society that my family exists in Sudan today is much more, in my mind, unfortunately, rigid and I don't want to use the word orthodox because I don't think that's the right term for it, but it's a much more restrictive and patriarchal version of Islam compared to the one that I grew up in. I actually would say that, you know, I sort of went in the other direction. I, over the years, have become more progressive if we use those words. Or I would sort of say, interested in gender justice, interested in, liberationary theology and so on, interested in the idea of my practice is inextricably tied to my interest in justice and so on. And that is how I situate myself within the community. That is quite challenging for a lot of even the people that I grew up with, and even my own family. My interest in challenging patriarchal norms is seen as, and I think there's this other sort of conversation that happens where anything deemed progressive is deemed Western, which I think is such a violation of what we have been gifted through Islam. Like my mum would always say to me growing up that we were Islam is a radical faith. Like when in the time of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, everything was radical about it. And so why would we just hold on to something and not move it instead of trying to apply those same principles? So I'm very much interested in how do I apply, and how do we apply the principles, those radically just and principles from 1400 years ago to the context that we have today. And with that, as I say, comes a lot of tension. And also I think, and this is something that I wanted to do with at least one of the essays in particular, which was called Islamic Social Justice, is actually educate I'm not a scholar, but I have access to lots of scholarship. And so what I try to do through my work is introduce the ideas that scholars write about and teach in a book like Talking About a Revolution, because I think people don't know. I think there's such a deep lack of understanding of our own faith. And I know it feels like a cop-out sometimes to say that, but I really think it's true. I think that sometimes when I have conversations, like in my nikah, my partner and I wrote our contract together, and that was what we signed when we got married in Sudan. And people were like, what do you mean? And I'm like, because we have the right within our faith to write our own marriage contract. That's such a powerful gift. And why would we throw that away? Why would we not even teach ourselves that this is, our right within the faith? And so I guess a lot of what I'm trying to do quite often is reintroduce to the people that would pay attention to my work in other contexts, try to reintroduce what I understand as the core tenets of the faith, why I love this faith so much, and appreciate that comes with a lot of pushback, but also trying not to get too caught up in that. And I'm still figuring this out. Because I think there is this, there is a lot of fear, quite often of being, if you're seen as okay, maybe I can reframe it this way. One of the reasons I know that, for example, my family in Sudan and people in Sudan will listen to what I say, or will read what I write, for example, and will be proud of me and will be willing to own me, is because they feel like I reflect a version of a good Muslim girl that they feel is acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And treading the line of being acceptable and therefore and therefore having the attention, while also trying to push people to think more to a more just and progressive way of seeing things without completely losing them, I think has been an interesting thing. I don't know if I'm always successful at it, but it's one of the things that I've been trying to navigate. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there is a balance. Next week, I'm going to go to the second meeting of the Women's Fatwa Council that started here before the pandemic. And it is groundbreaking because there is no organized body as such anywhere else in the Muslim world. But the first time they had it, I was not invited, and I thought, and so many of my friends in the network were, and I'm like, what happened? And then, then by the by, then you understand that there's certain issues that in order for them to establish some legitimacy, under the bigger title, they don't want to also push the places where the envelope has just been ripped apart by certain persons and or activities. So I get it. So, in fact, a graduate student here is doing the research on them. And, I basically asked her, what is it with regard to, for example, women imams? And, she said,
Mm,
they may personally agree, but they know that their constituency is not ready for it.
mm,
And so, what you were saying about you have to push forward, but you can't, you can't rip apart the very fibers.
mm,
And that's a very
mm.
delicate balance that I understand that people, have to make for themselves.
May I ask, like, how did you come to understanding your role in the various, because I guess we all have different roles in the sort of the push towards a more just society. Did you sort of know what you wanted to be and choose that, or was it kind of something after the fact?
It was definitely after the fact because
Mm,
I did not organize for any of the things that became, headliners. I was
mm,
that invited person, and I had to agree to the terms. Not all the terms were necessarily acceptable. I do write about it in my work as well. And because I had already spent 30 years
mm,
doing this critical reading for gender, which had already marked me as my own kind of
mm,
revolutionary. So in
mm,
some ways, I think that I became a good representative of, how to
mm,
have, Muslim women perform in certain roles because the prayer is a performative, and I accept it. And, some of the things that I, sort of by the by learned I might not have accepted. But I was
mm,
naive, in certain ways. But it turned out to be, now I call it embodied ethics, that you sort of like
mm,
put your money where your mouth is, that I had to stand
mm,
up for the gender justice that I sincerely believe in ways that even I, could not imagine. So,
mm,
it was something that, I mean, I have lots of barakah in my life, lots of things, that Allah has presented to me. I didn't have to chase them. They were just right there on my
mm,
doorstep. And, I accept that gift and I accept the responsibility and the consequences,
mm,
I do think that I didn't start out as kind of as enthusiastic a young person as you were. I was really quite conservative. I had my own Salafi days, voluntarily wore niqab for 4 years. So I
mm.
was really very, very nerdy, very introverted. And so I don't think this would have been the role I chose for myself. But
Yeah,
looking back at it
subhanallah.
retrospectively, especially, when you talk about, when you come into the cynicism, I think that
Mm,
cynicism is a natural result from the enthusiasm that you actually get tired of maintaining in the presence of the
yeah.
pushback. That's when you start to
Mm,
become cynical because you have put it out there and you put it out there with the best lie. Look at you, you're just so effervescent, So you put it out there with the best lie, and then people just like put all kinds of like dirt and muck and mire on top of it. And then you think, oh, I understand. This is the only way to get forward.
mm,
You've got to get to the muck and mire as well. And that causes you
mm,
to,
mm.
get a little less of the kind of naive enthusiasm and more mature. I started out in maturity because I had already, finished my
Mm,
PhD, the dissertation became my first book on a woman, 30 years old
mm.
this year. And
MashaAllah.
yeah, but just imagine that's the kind of thing I did in my youth, in my youth, yeah, because I fell in love with the
Mm,
Quran like not long after taking Shahada. And I said, this is it. This is the book, Dalik al-Kitabu.
mm,
And I dedicated the rest of my life to, articulating about that love, which I still have, alhamdulillah. So it became a career and then it became a revolution and blah, blah, blah. But I did not envision any kind of public role for myself. So
mm,
when those things happened, I had to accept.
mm,
And I to this day, I hate the word leader. I just published a chapter about the democratization of authority. I just don't like authoritative kinds of
mm,
perspectives on anything. I don't like binaries. I don't like hegemony. So
mm,
some of the things are there by default of the actions. But at the same time, I also felt like, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I feel like if I say no to this, if I don't step up, then I haven't really been true to, at least in terms of sort of
mm,
philosophical, theological impressions that I have about Islam and Tawheed, that I have to stand forward.
mm.
So it's kind of different. I'm sort of like an accidental revolution.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating. Thank you for sharing that because I was also relating to this idea that, because at some level, I always just wanted to be an engineer. At some level, I would be happy working, still in some plant or factory in the middle of nowhere, but subhanAllah, you sort of get put into situations or something comes to your doorstep and I think like Allah, when I went through the experiences that I went through in Australia, sort of in the public eye, I remember my mum saying to me, like, Allah, Allah is this is Allah's plan and He is preparing you for something, or that's the beauty of the faith, to give you a meaning for something that can sometimes feel so meaningless. But also I yeah, I think part of also wanting to put this book together was me thinking through, like, how do I make sense of the place that I have found myself in? And what do I do? Where am I going? Where is this taking me? I don't know, because it was never something that I chose for myself, but let me put faith, into the work and into the world, and inshallah, like, the path will continue to be revealed. But I mean, I never thought that I would be a writer. Like, not in a million years. And alhamdulillah, here I am, and that's like such an incredible thing. And I can only wonder what Allah has in store next,
Well, that's
Subhanallah.
my next question. I did, by the by, see that you are working on a play. Want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is also, the joy of Twitter. So I found this sort of like acting class that I signed up for because I wanted a hobby. And then through that I met a director who introduced me to some people, and I got into playwriting, whatever, long story. But the point is through Twitter I sort of entered the world of writing plays, and I found that I actually really enjoy the form, partly because it's much more collaborative. Writing books is a very lonely process, but there's something really joyful about being able to, write things and then see it almost immediately, or you can kind of see it up on its feet. But there's also something about theatre that I think is about the relationship between characters. And I'm fascinated by people, and I'm fascinated by the relationship between people, and about how, tension can be built and then released, and, with a live audience, all of that sort of thing. So the play that I'm working on at the moment, I've got two in development, but the one that is sort of the one that I most recently did a scratch night for, so I did a little performance of it. It's called No Escape, and it is about the tagline. It's set in an escape room, which is a sort of room where you sort of go in and play games, and you have to sort of sort things out together and escape. You sort of get given a challenge. But the sort of the tagline is, or the one-liner about it is, a group of friends grapple with the question of loyalty in the age of social media after one of them is cancelled online. So the idea is, this group of friends, one of them has been cancelled for something online, and they haven't hung out with each other for 5 or 6 months, and this is the first time they're all back together. And it's actually it's about how this massive act of public shaming, what are the repercussions in our private lives when this happens, and how everybody in that group has their own relationship with the thing that's happened. But in that, the person who has been shamed is sort of almost lost, and almost, and wants something from their friends, but also doesn't know how to ask for it, and doesn't know even how to deal with this enormous thing that's happened. And so, yeah, I'm really interested to see it out in the world, inshallah, because, and there's still a little way yet before we get a full production. But I just think, in the world that we live in today, where almost inevitably, we will know somebody that goes through an experience like this, we don't have the social norms for how to deal with it. We don't actually have the social norms for what happens when your friend starts, being piled onto, and people say terrible things, and what's the way to support them, what is the just and right thing to do, what if you don't agree with what they've done, but at the same time you don't want to add to the pain, and so on. So
wow, that's brilliant. I can't wait. Don't forget to tag
inshallah,
me, please.
will do, of course.
And how is being located in London? How have you settled in there?
I actually love London.
Okay.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah, I mean, at this particular moment in time, with massive inflation and, 12 years of Tory government, it's not, life, living standards are maybe not the highest, but, I found in London a city where I could find any of my people, and I mean, I grew up in a majority white conservative state. I did not imagine that I would meet other people who were like me, who had grown up in an English-speaking Western society, a child of African migrants. Like I just hadn't met people like that. Um, and and there's any kind of person you can find in London, whether it's, queer Muslim communities, whether it's, people who love to sew on a Tuesday evening, whether it's, stand-up comedy every night of the week, whether it's, incredible halaqah meetings, it's just anything that you want, you
And
can find in
food.
the city. And food, exactly. And every kind of food that you would like. Yeah, 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 yeah. Although I will say there's only one, I love Malaysian. There's only one good Malaysian place that I have found. So if anyone has recommendations for good Malaysian, um,
Come on down. Yeah,
I'll take
we'll
it.
have
Yeah,
to
yeah,
meet you
yeah,
in the
exactly.
region. Malaysian food is
Yeah.
also one of my favorites now.
Oh, yes, it's so good.
Yeah, no, I enjoy how easy it is to
Um,
get different types of food in the UK, which is not true everywhere. So that's fun.
no,
Yes.
definitely not. Yeah.
Well, I hope our paths cross in the physical space in 2023.
Inshallah, I would
Thank
love
you
that. I
again
would
for
love that.
agreeing to do this, for your enthusiasm. Keep the light shining, sis, because we need it in some dark times.
Thank you so much, Doctor. It has been such an honor. And thank you for reading my work.
Alhamdulillah,
It's so
alhamdulillah.
delightful.
Thank you for sharing it
Alhamdulillah.
because I only bought the novels and
No
then you sent
problem.
me the book that I'm actually talking with you about now. So it was
I'll
great.
the next time I see you, I'll bring a physical copy, inshallah.
Sign it for me, please, as well.
Yes, of course.